That night the snowstorm changed everything I believed forever completely. Karen called police on me without any real reason whatsoever. Flashing lights painted snow while neighbors watched silently nearby outside. I stood confused, wondering how things escalated so quickly tonight. The cold wind howled like warnings echoing across empty streets. Footsteps crunched behind me as officers approached with caution slowly. Karen pointed accusingly, shouting stories that twisted simple harmless truth. I tried speaking calmly, but nobody listened at first there. Snow kept falling, covering tracks and hiding what mattered most. My neighbor stepped forward quietly, watching everything with careful attention. He knew the truth long before anyone else noticed anything. Karen kept yelling, claiming danger where nothing truly existed before. Police radios crackled loudly, breaking the silence around us now. My breath froze, forming clouds drifting slowly into darkness tonight. I could feel tension rising between everyone standing outside together. She insisted I threatened her, though I barely spoke there. Her voice cut sharply through the storm-filled night air. Lights reflected off icy roads, creating eerie shifting shadows around. I realized something deeper was happening beyond her accusations now. The storm felt alive, whispering secrets nobody understood completely yet. My neighbor cleared his throat, preparing to speak out loudly. Everyone turned suddenly, sensing truth about to finally emerge now. Karen froze, noticing he was no longer supporting her claims. The moment shifted and everything felt completely different suddenly again. Police watched carefully, waiting for someone brave enough speaking first. Snowflakes landed quietly, covering footprints and muffling every sound outside. My heart pounded loudly as seconds stretched into long minutes. He finally spoke, revealing something none expected hearing there before. Karen's face changed slowly as truth started breaking through now. The officers exchanged looks, realizing this situation was different indeed. My neighbor described what really happened earlier that evening outside. His words carried weight, cutting through chaos and confusion instantly. Karen tried interrupting, but officers stopped her from speaking again. For first time she seemed unsure and slightly afraid now. The storm raged louder as tension reached its highest point. I wondered how everything turned against her so unexpectedly tonight. My neighbor kept explaining calmly, refusing to back down ever. Police began questioning her, instead changing entire direction immediately now. Her confident tone disappeared, replaced by nervous, uncertain silence quickly. Snowstorm continued raging as truth finally surfaced into view now. That night changed how everyone saw Karen forever afterward now. It also changed how I understood people around me now. Some stood silent while others finally chose telling truth openly. The snow kept falling, covering lies and revealing reality slowly. I knew nothing would ever be the same again after. But what happened next shocked us more than anything else. The wind roared louder as the police shifted their attention toward Karen. Only minutes earlier, she had stood there confident and loud, but now her voice carried a strange uncertainty. The flashing red and blue lights reflected across the snow, turning the entire street into a stage where truth was slowly unfolding. I could feel every eye moving between me, Karen, and my neighbor, waiting for what would come next. One officer stepped closer to my neighbor and calmly asked him to explain everything again, this time slowly and clearly. My neighbor nodded and spoke without hesitation. He described how he had been outside earlier, clearing snow from his driveway when he noticed Karen pacing back and forth near my yard. He said she looked upset long before anything happened. According to him, she was already on the phone, speaking loudly and angrily. Karen tried to interrupt again, but the officer gently raised his hand, asking her to wait. Her face tightened with frustration. Snow continued falling, sticking to our coats and hair as the cold air cut deeper into the moment. My neighbor explained that nothing unusual had happened at first. I was simply outside, brushing snow off my car, preparing to move it before the road got worse. He said I hadn't spoken to Karen at all. I hadn't even noticed she was watching. But Karen suddenly started yelling from her porch, accusing me of blocking her driveway, even though my car was nowhere near it. The officers listened carefully. One of them glanced over at the tire tracks buried under fresh snow. Another shined a flashlight across the area, studying the scene quietly. Karen shifted uncomfortably as the silence stretched longer. My neighbor continued, explaining how Karen's voice kept getting louder. She was shouting into her phone, telling someone that I was causing trouble. He said he knew something was wrong because none of it was true. That's when he realized she was calling the police. Karen finally spoke, her voice sharp again, insisting she felt threatened. But the confidence she had earlier was fading. Her words didn't carry the same strength. The officer calmly asked her to explain exactly what I had done. She hesitated, just for a moment, but that moment was enough for everyone to notice. I stood quietly, letting the truth speak for itself. Snowflakes fell steadily, and the cold air seemed to hold every word in place. My neighbor stepped back after finishing, his job done. The officers looked between us again, their expressions changing slightly. Something had shifted, something important, and then one officer asked Karen a question that completely changed the direction of the night. The officer's question was simple, but the silence that followed felt heavy and endless. He asked Karen what exact moment made her feel threatened. Not what she thought, not what she assumed, but what truly happened. Karen opened her mouth, then paused. For the first time since the police arrived, she seemed unsure of what to say. The snowstorm continued to swirl around us, covering the street in a soft white blanket. The wind pushed against our jackets, making the flashing police lights flicker across the drifting snow. I could see Karen thinking, trying to piece together something convincing. But the more she hesitated, the more obvious it became that her story wasn't as solid as she first made it sound. One of the officers gently repeated the question, giving her another chance to explain. Karen finally spoke, saying she felt nervous when she saw me outside near my car. She claimed I was watching her house and that it made her uncomfortable. Her voice wasn't as strong now. It carried a hint of doubt, as if even she knew it didn't make complete sense. The officer nodded but didn't react right away. He looked toward the driveway, then back at my car. Snow covered most of the ground, but the tire tracks still showed where everything had been earlier. Another officer walked slowly around the area, shining his flashlight near the road and across the yard. My neighbor quietly stepped closer to me and said under his breath that everything would be fine. He told me to stay calm and let the truth do its work. His calm presence helped settle the tight feeling in my chest. I hadn't done anything wrong, but moments like this can still make your heart race. Karen crossed her arms, clearly uncomfortable now. The storm had grown colder, and her anger was slowly being replaced by tension. She looked at the officers as if expecting them to take her side, but they remained neutral, just observing and listening. Then one of the officers asked her another question. He wanted to know why she had called in such a rush. He mentioned that her report sounded urgent, almost like an emergency. That made Karen shift her weight again, glancing briefly toward the houses nearby. The street was quiet except for the wind. A few neighbors had their porch lights on, watching from a distance. Everyone could sense something unusual happening. Karen tried to explain, saying she was scared and didn't know what else to do. But her voice didn't match her earlier confidence. The officers exchanged a quick look. Something in the situation didn't add up. And that's when one officer turned his attention back to my neighbor, asking if he had noticed anything else before the call was made. My neighbor took a slow breath before answering, as if deciding how much to reveal. The wind pushed snow across the road, making the moment feel even more intense. The officer's flashlight reflected off the drifting flakes, lighting up the space between us like a quiet spotlight. Everyone stood still, waiting. He explained that before Karen called the police, she had been outside for quite some time. He said she wasn't just watching me. She had been pacing up and down her porch, talking loudly on her phone. At one point, she even walked closer to the edge of her driveway, looking toward my house again and again. The officer asked what she was saying on the phone. My neighbor hesitated for a moment, then said her voice carried through the wind. He couldn't hear every word, but he clearly heard her say she was tired of this, and that she was going to teach him a lesson tonight. Karen quickly shook her head, denying it. She said he must have misunderstood. But her voice sounded nervous, not angry like before. The officers stayed calm. One of them quietly asked her why she would say something like that if she was only scared. Karen tried to explain, saying she was frustrated and stressed from the storm. She said the snow, the noise, and everything else had made her anxious. But something about the situation still didn't feel right. The other officer walked over to where my car had been parked earlier. He crouched down and brushed snow away with his glove, revealing the ground beneath. After a moment, he stood up and looked back toward us. He pointed at the tire marks and asked if anyone had moved a vehicle recently. I explained that I had tried to move my car earlier to keep it from getting stuck, but the snow was too deep, so I stopped. The officer nodded and turned back to Karen. He asked her if my car had actually blocked her driveway at any point. She paused again, just for a second. That pause said more than any answer could. Finally, she admitted that the car hadn't blocked her driveway completely. She said it was just too close, and made her uncomfortable. The officer wrote something down in his notebook while listening. The snowstorm began to slow slightly, and the wind didn't feel as harsh anymore. It was almost like the night itself was calming as the truth slowly came out. Karen's confident posture had disappeared. Her arms were crossed tightly now, and she avoided looking at anyone directly. The officer then asked her one final question, one that made her go completely silent. The officer's final question hung in the air longer than anything said that night. He asked Karen why she told the dispatcher that I was acting aggressively when no one had seen or heard anything like that. The snowstorm had nearly settled, leaving behind a quiet, cold stillness that made every word feel sharper. Karen didn't answer right away. She looked down at the snow beneath her feet, shifting nervously. For the first time, it was clear she didn't have a quick explanation ready. The confidence she had earlier was completely gone. Her shoulders dropped slightly, and she avoided eye contact with the officers. One of them gently reminded her that emergency calls are taken seriously, especially during dangerous weather when resources are already stretched thin. Karen finally spoke, her voice much softer now. She said she felt overwhelmed and thought things might get out of control. But even as she said it, her words sounded unsure, like she was trying to fill the silence with anything she could. My neighbor stood quietly beside me, arms folded, watching everything. I could tell he wasn't angry. He just wanted the situation to be understood for what it really was. A few porch lights flickered in the distance as people continued to watch from their homes. No one came outside, but everyone could feel the tension. The officers asked a few more careful questions, trying to understand exactly what made Karen feel the need to call. Each answer she gave sounded smaller than the last. The story that once sounded urgent and dramatic now felt weak and uncertain. One officer walked over to speak with the other for a moment. They talked quietly while glancing back toward us. I could see them nodding, as if they had already made sense of what happened. When they came back, their tone was calm but firm. They explained that it was important to be accurate when calling for help, especially during a storm when emergency teams might be needed elsewhere. Karen nodded slowly, clearly realizing how serious the situation had become. I stayed quiet, letting them handle everything. I didn't feel angry anymore. Mostly, I felt tired and cold. The storm, the lights, and the tension had drained all the energy from the night. Karen looked toward my neighbor for a moment, as if hoping he might say something to support her. But he didn't speak. He simply looked back at her calmly, standing by the truth he had already shared. Then one of the officers turned to me and asked a question I wasn't expecting at all. The officer's voice was calm when he turned toward me, but the question still caught me off guard. He asked if I had any problems with Karen before tonight. For a moment, I just stood there, feeling the cold air on my face and watching the last flakes of snow drift down under the streetlights. I thought carefully before answering. I didn't want to make things worse or turn the situation into something bigger than it already was. I told him the truth. I said there had been small disagreements in the past, nothing serious. Just the usual neighbor complaints about parking, noise, or snow being pushed too close to the property line during winter. The officer listened closely, nodding as I spoke. He didn't interrupt, he just let me finish. I explained that we had never had a major argument, never anything that felt dangerous or threatening. It was always small things that usually ended quickly. Karen shifted slightly where she stood, clearly uncomfortable hearing it out loud. The tension between us wasn't new, but tonight it had gone further than it ever had before. My neighbor then spoke again, adding that he had seen the two of us exchange words a few times in the past, but nothing that ever turned into a real problem. He said it always ended with both of us going back inside. The officer asked if there was anything different about tonight. I looked around at the snow-covered street, the police lights reflecting off the icy ground, and then back at Karen. I told him I wasn't sure. I said the storm had made everything more stressful, and maybe that made things feel bigger than they really were. Karen finally spoke again, her voice quieter now than at any point before. She said she had been dealing with a lot lately and felt on edge. She didn't go into detail, but her tone carried something different this time. Less anger, more exhaustion. The officers listened without judgment. One of them explained that stressful situations can make small problems feel much larger. But he also reminded both of us that calling the police should only happen when there is real danger. I nodded. Karen nodded too, though she still didn't look at me. The storm had almost stopped completely now. The street felt calm again, like nothing had happened. The flashing lights were still bright, but the tension that filled the air earlier had slowly faded. Just when it seemed like everything was coming to an end, one of the officers received a message on his radio that suddenly changed the mood again. The sharp crackle of the radio cut through the quiet street, making everyone look toward the officer at the same time. He turned slightly away from us, listening carefully as a voice spoke urgently from the other end. Even though we couldn't hear every word, the tone alone was enough to shift the mood. Something else was happening nearby. The officer responded quickly, speaking into the radio in a low, focused voice. The other officer stepped closer, waiting to hear what was going on. For a few seconds, the attention moved away from us completely. Karen looked confused, and I could see my neighbor watching closely, trying to understand what had changed. When the officer finished, he turned back toward us and explained that another car had slid off the road just a few streets away. The storm had made the roads dangerous, and emergency calls were starting to come in. He said they might need to leave soon to check on the situation. Hearing that made everything feel different. The night wasn't just about our argument anymore. There were people out there who might actually need help. The seriousness of the weather suddenly felt much more real. Karen looked down at the snow again, her expression tightening slightly. I wondered if she was thinking about how her call had brought officers here while something more serious was happening somewhere else. She didn't say anything, but the silence spoke loudly enough. The officers quickly wrapped up their questions. Their tone was still calm, but now there was a sense of urgency. They reminded both of us to stay inside as much as possible until the storm fully passed. The roads were still icy, and more accidents could happen. My neighbor nodded, thanking them for coming out in such rough weather. I did the same. No matter how the situation started, they had handled everything professionally. Karen finally spoke again, but this time her voice was much softer. She quietly said she didn't realize the weather had caused so many problems around the area. It almost sounded like she was apologizing without actually saying the words. The officers gave a final nod before walking back toward their vehicles. The red and blue lights reflected off the snow one last time as they prepared to leave. The moment felt like the end of something, like a chapter closing. But just as the police cars started to move, my neighbor said something quietly that made Karen freeze in place again. As the police cars slowly began to pull away, the sound of tires crunching over packed snow filled the quiet street. The flashing lights faded as they turned the corner, heading toward the new emergency. For a moment, everything felt calm again. The storm had nearly stopped, and the neighborhood returned to that cold, heavy silence that comes after a long night. That's when my neighbor spoke, his voice steady but low. He didn't raise it, but it was loud enough for both of us to hear. He said he hoped things wouldn't go this far again, especially during a night when people truly needed help. Karen stopped walking. She didn't turn around right away, but her shoulders stiffened. The words clearly hit her. After a second, she slowly faced us. There was no anger on her face anymore. No sharp tone. Just something quiet and uncertain. He continued, not in an accusing way, but in a calm, honest voice. He reminded her that the storm had made everything harder for everyone. People were trying to stay safe, keep their cars from getting stuck, and help each other when they could. Calling the police over something small could pull them away from someone who might really need them. Karen looked down at the snow again. The wind had died down completely now, and the streetlights reflected softly off the white ground. The whole moment felt still, like time had slowed just enough for everything to sink in. For the first time that night, she spoke without raising her voice. She said she hadn't thought about it that way. She admitted the storm had made her nervous, and she reacted too quickly. The words came out slowly, like she wasn't used to saying them. I didn't respond right away. I wasn't sure what to say. The night had been long, and everything had changed so quickly. But hearing her speak calmly felt different from anything that had happened earlier. My neighbor gave a small nod, like he understood. He wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. He just wanted the tension to end. Karen finally looked in my direction. She didn't say much, just a quiet sentence about things getting out of hand. It wasn't a full apology, but it was close enough to feel real. The cold air felt lighter somehow. The storm had passed, and so had the anger that started it all. But even as everything settled, I couldn't stop thinking about how quickly things could change in a single night. The street was finally quiet again. The storm had passed, leaving behind thick layers of snow covering the roads, the yards, and the long tire tracks from earlier. The flashing police lights were gone, and the cold night felt calmer than it had in hours. For the first time since everything began, it felt like the tension had completely disappeared. Karen stood still for a moment, looking around as if she was seeing the street differently now. The anger that had filled her voice earlier was gone. In its place was something quieter. Something more thoughtful. My neighbor gave a small nod and slowly turned to head back toward his house, brushing snow off his sleeves as he walked. I stayed where I was, taking in the silence. The cold air felt sharp, but it didn't bother me anymore. I realized how quickly everything had escalated over something so small. A simple moment outside during a snowstorm had turned into flashing lights, questions, and tension that spread across the entire street. Karen finally spoke again, her voice low and calm. She said the storm had made her anxious and that she reacted without thinking. She didn't look directly at me at first, but the words sounded honest. After a pause, she added that she shouldn't have called the police so quickly. It wasn't a dramatic apology, and she didn't make a big scene. But the way she said it felt real. I nodded, letting her know I understood. There was no point in holding on to anger. The night had already been long enough. She slowly walked back toward her house, her steps careful on the icy path. The porch light turned on as she reached her door, and for a moment, she stopped and looked back down the street. Then she went inside, and the door closed quietly behind her. My neighbor waved once from his driveway before going inside too. One by one, the lights in the nearby houses turned off as people finally returned to their normal routines. The storm had ended, and so had the chaos it brought with it. I brushed the snow off my car again, finishing what I had started earlier. The cold metal felt solid under my hands, and everything seemed peaceful now. The road was empty, and the wind was barely moving. That night taught me something I wouldn't forget. Sometimes, the biggest problems start from the smallest misunderstandings. And sometimes, the people you least expect are the ones who stand up for the truth when it matters most.
Welcome to Karen Universe, where we dive into every wild, quirky, and intriguing story out there. That night, the snowstorm was brutal, and Karen suddenly called the police on me. I thought everyone would take her side, but then my own neighbor turned against her. What the side to the police next changed the entire story. If you enjoyed the, don't forget to subscribe to Karen Universe, share with your friends and drop your thoughts in the comments.